What's up, guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Suetonius context. I am so excited for this episode. This is one of my favorite historians, but before we can dive into the reasons why, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you have so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Just a disclaimer before we get into it, it is important that I highlight this is only a context episode about Suetonius. And by that I mean I enjoy going into the authors behind the ancient works before we dive in as a little family, chapter by chapter, book by book, into these people and their work. So therefore, this episode is not summarizing anything that Suetonius wrote, but merely trying to give you guys a bit of context as to who the man was behind the words. So if you are looking for a Suetonius summary, you can find the videos that follow this one, which will get more into that, but this is just about him. Well, as much as I can give you about him. Suetonius was probably born sometime around 69 CE or AD, depending on which one you use. We think in Rome, but we're not entirely sure. And he dies after 122 CE. Now, I know that everybody listening to this is going to be like, what do you mean you think? You're uncertain, huh? When it comes to ancient authors, we as historians very much have to look at the work that they published, the time that they were writing about, who else references them, and piece together their life because they are not writing about themselves. So therefore, when I said sometime around 69, if you say sometime around 69, maybe 70, maybe 68, people still think that you know what you're talking about. Like, it doesn't really matter all that much because we're not sure. And also, we think he was born in Rome, but we have no idea. The reason why we think he was born in Rome is because at least he spent most of his life there, regardless of whether he was born or not. So it's kind of safe to say that he was born in Rome, even though there's no actual written evidence for that. Dying sometime after 122 is literally the only thing that you can say about his death. So, look, you get used to this when discussing the ancient world, but just take my word for it. So CE AD, this is now in the period where we are fully a Roman Empire. Okay, that is important because we've discussed some historians who are sort of on the brink. They have been existing as the Republic turned into the Empire, etc., etc. We've looked at some people who were just from the Roman Republic. We are now in full empire. Empire has been established. Empire is now comfortable. That is when Suetonius is writing. Suetonius is technically a Roman biographer, where his two most famous works go into the lives of incredibly famous people from the ancient Roman world. So technically he is not writing histories in the sense of here's a scope of X war, here's a scope of X time period. He is really zeroing in on these people, on these incredibly famous people, and he is trying to, in the same way that I'm trying to in this episode, very much get to the person behind, in his instance, the facade. The first of his two main works that made him famous from the ancient world is, in Latin, De Viris Illustribus, which just translates to Concerning Illustrious Men, which is a collection of short biographies about the most famous people of the literature scene during this time period. So think Virgil, think Horace, think Terence, all of those people were included in this collection of biographies. And the second, which is certainly what's put him on the map throughout all time, is De Vita Caesarum. Now, of course, you could say De Vita. I certainly was taught in Latin class that all the V's are W sounding, but I've heard people say it as V's. It doesn't really matter either way. That's how I say the Latin. But that just translates to the lives of the 12 Caesars, which talks about the first 11 emperors, or actually as they are written down as princeps, which is the first citizens of ancient Rome. Well, technically the first one is Julius Caesar, so he's not one of those, but he certainly starts off the long... You know what? I'll get into that in the text. That's not for today. Much like any other ancient person, piecing together Suetonius' early life and early career is quite tricky. I will do my best, and historians of the modern age have certainly done their best to try and figure out exactly who Suetonius was. Now, we do know that his family were not incredibly rich. They were not incredibly wealthy. However, they were of considerable standing. So by that, I do mean that he ends up having a patron in Pliny the Younger and became Pliny the Younger's official letter writer, which I know that sounds really weird, but from the ancient world, that's like very important, right? You had to find a patron. The way I explain this in modern terms is kind of like a mentor, right? So a patron would vouch for you, they would get you other jobs, they would pass you along into the industries, and having a good patron basically meant everything in the ancient world. So to have Pliny the Younger be your patron is a very, very good position to be in. After Pliny the Younger dies, though, Suetonius does get another patron in a man called Clarus. Now, this man, we don't know much about him and about their relationship, but we know that Suetonius, did dedicate his book to his second patron. So it was probably a good relationship. And by book, I mean he dedicated the lives of the 12 Caesars to this man. Now, what is interesting is that seemingly along this track, you would assume, if you're, an ancient historian looking at this, you would assume that Suetonius is moving towards like a law career, right? He's moving towards like a rhetoric career in some kind of a way. And it seems that at some point he rejects that entirely. Again, at what point, we don't really know. However, we know he ends up working as controller of the Roman libraries and keeper of the archives right after Hadrian's accession. I really stumbled over that, but right after Hadrian gets his little position in 117 CE, right? So he steps up to be Emperor Princeps. Then we have Suetonius suddenly have this incredible honor, and it doesn't stop there. After being made keeper of the archives, Suetonius then becomes the advisor to the emperor on cultural matters, and probably in around 121, again, take the dates with a grain of salt, but probably sometime around there, Suetonius was promoted to secretary of imperial correspondence. In 122, Suetonius gets dismissed because of his neglect of court formalities. Now, what exactly that means, we don't get all the details. However, in 122, he's basically booted out of there incredibly quickly. After he's booted out is when he dedicates his life to writing. And so I mentioned these two texts at the start of the video. We, first of all, again, just to remind you, have Concerning Illustrious Men, as well as the lives of the 12 Caesars. Now, Concerning Illustrious Men came first. Okay, so that was the first of the two, and this is what put him on the map in the ancient world. Although, as is with most things from the ancient world, that doesn't survive to us. I know, it really sucks sometimes to exist in this space, but it also kind of makes it fun, being like, ooh, it's a mystery. So De Viris Illustribus, we do have one section that survives. However, the way that we know about everything that's within the book is simply because this was kind of like a one-stop shop for a very long time when figuring out the lives of these very famous poets and literary people, right? So this was repeated, it was referenced a lot. So it's not gonna be Suetonius's word, but you can find certain parts of it thanks to the fact that so many people really, really loved this. Now, the reason why we are here and the reason why most people know Suetonius is because of the lives of the 12 Caesars. Now, before I tell you a little bit about that work, let me just mention all of the people who are spoken about, because I know that obviously, people are going to be like, who, what are the orders of the Roman emperors? Don't you worry, we're going to go through the first 11. In my intro, I did say that it was the first emperors, the first princeps, though technically number one on the list in the first chapter of the lives of the 12 Caesars is Julius Caesar. Okay, so Julius Caesar, although everybody says he was the first emperor of Rome, he absolutely wasn't. He just happened to hold a lot of offices all at one point. Fascinating story, fascinating man. Genuinely, the way that he worked his way through society and got these incredible status titles without being the correct age or from the correct family or all of it. Brilliant, genuinely brilliant. But Suetonius starts with Julius Caesar, moves into Augustus. We then get Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Let's see how many of these I can do off the top of my head. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, 11, so there's one more. Oh, Domitian. There we go. But those are the first 11 that we cover in the book. And what makes the Lives of the 12 Caesars so different is that it is a biography of them. So unlike historians that we have seen before, Suetonius wasn't really fussed with all of these huge events. Like, we don't go into the life of Augustus and talk about all of these really monumental political events that he was part of. For sure, they are mentioned, like, don't get me wrong, but it's more so about creating a scope of character. Who was Augustus? What things led him to greatness? What things did he do? What do we know about his early life? What about his personal life? How does the man handle his drink? Like, I'm not even joking. We get like a nice little digression about how embarrassing it is that Augustus can't like take too much alcohol without throwing up. It is so funny. So as you can tell, Suetonius is gossipy. The way that I always tell people to read Suetonius is very much like reading the Daily Mail. He's there for a good story. He wants to get into the nooks and cranny of who these people are. However, is it all necessarily accurate? I mean, no. A lot of it is just rumor. A lot of it is just, I heard this thing and I want to repeat it here. It's almost like, you know, when you go onto TMZ and it's like, we reached out to representatives and they didn't comment, kind of a thing. Suetonius doesn't reach out to representatives. He just tells you the story and he's like, do with it what you will. Now, along with Suetonius being unbelievably enjoyable to read for all the gossipy stories and the interesting look into the lives of the people that he always wanted to write about and dive into, it is obviously important to acknowledge why this was so important on a more serious note and not just this was really fun to read. When it comes to the lives of these men, for the longest time, Suetonius was the only source for it, right? It's not normal for historians to dive into necessarily who these people were. As you guys know from my other context videos, that tends to be a big problem where we don't really know the man behind the duty that they served or the war that they served or whatever happens to be. We just kind of hear of their great accolades and that's really it, because a lot of ancient historians don't deem that as being important. So Suetonius, for the longest time, was the only person who did that. And most importantly, he was the only person who did that before we had any other evidence. So before we had archaeological evidence to kind of back up all of these stories, before we had any kind of investigation in that sense, we literally just had Suetonius. So it means that as you read it, there are going to be lots and lots of famous stories, which, like I just said, a lot of them have been, argued against, where it's like, well, this doesn't really match up to this thing, or there's this guy that comes later that says this thing, or etc., etc. So I just wanted to let you guys know that, because as we read through the book, obviously, my purpose is to create summaries. So I'm just going to be reading exactly what's on the page and not going into the analysis of all the stories. However, it goes without saying that a lot of the times we have been able to match up stories to later documentation, to later archaeology, to, lots of things that happen later on. And we have been able to say, well, this is a great story, but what's really going on? So Suetonius is not trying to write a comprehensive history at all, right? He's not trying to tell us about great men, but instead he's really just trying to give us a little bit of insight into their strengths and frailties as a separate unit, right? As who they are. We are just looking at the people themselves. Just before we leave, I think that there are two notes that are kind of important to mention about Suetonius, about his work, and in particular about the Lives of the 12 Caesars. So first things first, we do have some sections missing from Julius Caesar, the first section of the book. However, the rest of it is extant. So even though there are some moments where you're like, oop, that just jumps really quickly, that's because that's lost. This is one of the most well-kept, I would say, one of the most well-kept pieces of ancient literature that gives us a little insight into the ancient world. However, even though I've mentioned the first two books that Suetonius is really famous for, like I said, the Concerning Illustrious Men and obviously the Lives of the 12 Caesars, there are other works that are attributed to Suetonius, of which we have quite literally nothing. So I did write these ones down. We do have, for example, On Famous Courtesans. Supposedly he wrote that. That would have been so cool to read, but that's dead to us. The other one we have is On the Kings, which is pretty self-explanatory. And even there was a work about the statesman Cicero. Again, none of those survived though, so I didn't think it was really important to highlight them at all throughout this video. So this series following this and looking into Suetonius will be specifically looking into the lives of the 12 Caesars. I will not be talking about fragments. I will not be talking about anything else on that front. And as I said, I will also not be analyzing the stories. I will not be analyzing the book. And so therefore, if you guys do want some more analysis, because we're just going to be going into exactly what's on the page, let me know in the comments below, because then I can start looking for experts, professors, scholars who do specialize in Suetonius and invite them on the channel to join us for a more in-depth discussion so that we can offer you, a lot of different areas of conversation if that is something that you're interested in. If not, no stress. We're just going to do the summary and then I will leave you at that. But I think that's everything that I have to say about my favorite man. I'm so excited because now we get to actually dive into the work, into the gossip. I cannot wait to tell you these stories because genuinely they are so fun and some of them are so wild. Like as you read it, you're like, what the hell? Did you check if this is real? Because this is quite the accusation to make against someone. It gets gossipy, it gets heated, it gets juicy. This is probably the most fun read that you will have in a historical sense from the ancient world, just for the pure absurdity and fun of it. So I am truly so unbelievably thrilled to be getting into Suetonius, and I can't wait to take you guys along the journey with me. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here all about Suetonius. I'll see you guys then.